I would typically lavish you with a long-winded introduction, but every time I provide an introduction to someone who's intellectually distinguished as you are, I trip over my words and lose my thread before we even begin in a vague attempt to sound even half as intelligent as you are. So allow me to simply say, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, my name's Lorne Risley, host of the Halcyon Show. How you doing? Let us exude copious amounts of rampant applause for my guest today. One of the most renowned and accomplished journalists and reporters working today is the Athletic's own, the master of the craft, Mr Adam Crafton. How are you, sir?
Thank you. That was a lovely intro.
I tried my best. Again, the problem is, I know that introductions can seem that they needed because of people who may not be familiar with your previous work, especially in something as football journalism, where I imagine a lot more people are going to be familiar with your work as opposed to you. They're going to have read a lot of what you've put out, but then the second you go, any danger of some credit for this? And would you want credit for sourcing it, writing it, researching it, double checking it? As a football journalist or as a football reporter, how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's an issue on TikTok. No, it's not a huge issue. It's one of those things where we at The Athletic, as with many publications now, I think sometimes I get the impression that people think we're the only website that are asking people to pay to access content, and the reality is that's it's the reality of the Times of London, the Daily Telegraph. Even Mail Online for a long time was free. Now Mail Plus is charging people to subscribe. So and even the BBC is a subscription service, right? Because people pay each year the license fee. It's just we kind of have the impression that because you just turn on the TV and it's there, that it's a free service. But I'm going away from the point, which is one of the reasons that you can get a bit frustrated. Sometimes it's like you can do an interview which can take ages to get, and then there's a lot of aggregator accounts now on Twitter that will basically just write out all the quotes one after another from the interview, and then it's just like all there, and they'll put at the end of the tweet that's from The Athletic, but there might not always be a link to it. I don't really mind aggregator accounts. If you're doing like 3 or 4 tweets and then you put a link to it at the end, and that's really nice. That's good practice. But I just sometimes it's not frustration. I think it's more that sometimes people, I think, don't necessarily understand that something that will take you 5-10 minutes to read in the morning on the tube can in some cases take about 12 months to get over the line and get that person actually talking to you. So yeah, that's all it is. But I have bigger frustrations in life.
Well, the way I equate it is, if people don't understand the frustration, is it's a weird analogy, but bear with me. Do you remember that time when Kanye West and Rihanna did a song with Paul McCartney, but there was a generation of people that didn't know who Paul McCartney was and thought, do you know what, this is going to be great for this guy's career, I hope he goes on to bigger and better things. And then a whole other generation of people had to go, he was in the Beatles. What do you mean it goes on to bigger things? He was in the biggest band ever. But the idea being is that the aggregator sites and these, and the reason I reference TikTok specifically is because YouTube clips these days can be clipped and right. Sort of dissected and disseminated at will. And unless you're smart enough to have a logo or to have the source, from the original clip, then it becomes information that is kind of widely spread. And the person who, like you say, goes to the rigmarole and the hassle of trying to procure it in the first place never really sees the kind of turnaround, which you can view from 2 different ways. It's good to get information out into the wider populace. That's always a good thing, especially if it is well sourced and well written. And you'd probably want the right information being disseminated as broadly as possible. But at the same time, The Athletic, for my money, is, and I know what you're saying about the paid services, but The Athletic seem to make a point of saying, no, we want quality. We want to assure you when you come to The Athletic that the best people are writing for us, that these are the people that take what they do very seriously, but also have a great deal of passion for what they do. And when I saw you in what can only be described as probably the 3rd or 4th time I've seen one of these Twitter exchanges where you have to explain calmly and politely to someone, listen, man, it's not a lot to ask for credit. I worked hard to put this together. Jeff and his mate, who have a YouTube channel who clipped this, saw my video today. That's the extent of their efforts. Like, it's only fair that you cultivate that kind of response. At least that's how you attempt to broach it online. But I know Twitter's not the best place for discourse when making a point when 40,000 people are yelling in the opposite direction at you.
Yeah, and yeah, it's not a huge deal. It's just, there is copyright law, right? Right, like,
Yeah, the small, tiny, this whole thing
like,
called "It belongs to me."
yeah, there are things that we expect in the same way as, if I was quoting from, if, for example, a Man United YouTube channel had an interview with, I don't know, Ralph Rangnick tomorrow, and he said lots of interesting things, and then I was writing a piece in a couple of months' time where I used some of the quotes from that, I would say in my piece who he's spoken to and make sure we have a link to it, right? Because it's just, I don't know, it's just like, for example, I don't know if people went to, for example, university and they had to write essays or dissertations, and at the end, you put your sourcing and you put your credits and things like that. So that's all it is. It's just about, I just think it's politeness, to be honest.
Politeness
Like,
on social media?
The company might argue it's financially motivated. I just think it's like politeness and decency.
100%. Well, I mean, on a slightly lighter note, though, even though it must be, if not infuriating, as it would be if I found out that someone was copying my videos, I'd be positively livid. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that it's not that big of a deal from the perspective of, again, you still ultimately get credit at the end of the day. What's it like putting together an interview of that magnitude when you know that every fan in the world wants the kind of access to a footballer that you ended up getting in the instance of Eric Cantona and indeed Bruno Fernandes, but none of them are going to be in the position to be able to ask the kind of articulate questions to the length and depth that you're going to be able to and have the opportunity to do so. What's it like putting those things together from your perspective? Is it a thrill? Is it just the combination of a lot of hard work? I mean, what do you go through when you're putting together something like that?
That's a really good question. And that's what I say when I'm trying to buy myself time to give an answer.
Cha-la-la-la-la.
Yeah.
I shall do my happy dance for him until he comes up with an answer.
No, I think there is there's several things going on in my head when that happens. One is I have a job to do, right? And as you say, that access is quite rare, and therefore you have to make the most of it. And I have to make sure that when I'm sending that back to my editor, or whoever's going to be editing it afterwards, it needs to be, what you hope it would be for that time. That doesn't always happen. The other side of it is, there is that moment where you're like, shit, loads of people would love to do this, right? And there's times in sports journalism, as there is, I'm sure, with absolutely every career, where you have frustrations and anxieties, and you get fed up with people and you're moaning, because that's what we do, right? That's what we do in life. Like, we all think we have it hard, every so often, and we all think it could be better, and this could be better, and they could be better, and everything like that. But those are the moments where you're like, this is the best job in the world. This is the best job in the world. And there are, I'd say, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people that would love to have that opportunity. So it's about enjoying it as well. That's one of the things that I probably need to get better at, is just making sure you actually enjoy these moments, as well as, do them well from a professional point of view, but actually make sure you're always having fun with it as well, right?
100%. I think. Well, I'm reminded of. Oh God, I'm becoming an aunt. A Facebook meme where there's a guy on land and he's waving to a guy on a boat. He's so happy to see the boat, but then you see the guy on the boat waving to the guy on the land, saying, "Oh, thank God for land." And it's the idea of when you're in the thing that you're in, you never fully appreciate it until it's past. But I think there's a certain kernel to that is maybe not as prolific in a lot of people, because I mean, this is a magnificent opportunity, by the way. Thank you again, by the way. I'll say this after we stop recording, but thank you very much for the opportunity first and foremost. But like you say, I mean, and it's weird because you would think footballers wouldn't be so reticent to give interviews, but when you think about their plight for more than 2 seconds, where you know that every single thing that they say is going to be analysed by every publication on the face of the planet for any, is this an indication of a transfer rumour? Is this a spat? Is this potential rift with another? And it's like, of course they're not going to talk to many people. So the kind of implied trust and the kind of the benefits that they're looking to draw versus the negativity, that opportunity has to be exclusive. It has to be extremely rare, and you have to be careful with it. So you have to kind of agonize over it a little bit, which makes it difficult to enjoy. So I guess the question is, how are you going to try and enjoy those? Like, do you have an idea of how you're going to broach that, or do you think you'll just take a breath and let whatever happens happens? Obviously with prep, of course.
No, I just thought it would be a good thing to say during this interview, really.
Oh, okay.
That I should try and enjoy it more. I haven't put that much thought into how I would actually go about that.
So it's something you're going to do going forward, you mean, when you have the opportunity to speak to?
So. I think there's times where in interviews where you can probably push back a bit against what footballers are saying.
Do you feel a responsibility to do that with footballers, though?
I don't know. If they're not making... If you don't agree with what they're saying, I'm not saying like... For example, I recently interviewed Bruno Fernandes. I asked him about playing with Cristiano Ronaldo, and he gives me an answer which is very, very good from a media perspective for Bruno Fernandes, right? Quite a compellingly told answer saying, I actually enjoy playing with him, and it helps me in this way and that way and that way and that way. And I kind of just sort of accepted that. And part of me, when I was sort of watching it back, listening to it back, was thinking I could have followed up there and said, but actually, does that ring true? Does that really ring true? What you've just said there, could I press you a bit harder? Equally, they're just footballers. Talking about playing with a different footballer, like, it doesn't matter. We're not saving lives here. There's other stories you might work on where it matters a lot more to be pushing a bit harder and asking questions and things like that. But I think generally in most conversations with footballers, it's really about giving them a platform to show themselves and connect with the fans. And the sports journalist in that moment is almost like a connector or a medium. Right, a medium to connect the supporters to the player, obviously to ask things that we want to know as media, but I think it's about allowing those young guys, young women to show themselves, and because that's a really hard thing to do when you're having to play players who are like 19, 20. Imagine being interviewed at 19 and 20, and that could go out to an audience of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, and if you say something wrong, then it goes very, very big. And so I have quite a lot of empathy for footballers when they're doing these interviews, because it's quite a hard thing to do, and they're at the same time they're then like overtrained and media trained to the point where they just sort of don't really say anything at all, and then everyone becomes a bit frustrated with them, and it doesn't really become a pleasurable experience for anyone. But I understand why that's developed, because of the way that maybe players have tripped up in the past or been
one slip of the tongue and they're a meme now. So 100% you can understand it.
Exactly. It's like someone like Harry Maguire, for example, gets a load of stick.
He leans up against one fence at a World Cup and he'll never live it down.
To be fair, I think that was as good as it got for him in terms of the memes. But I mean, like at the end of games where he has to, there was like last season, Man United losing almost every week, and he's having to come out at the end of the game and say something because he's the captain. And what's he meant to say, right? We didn't play well. It's not good enough. We're going to try harder. We're all trying to put it right. But that wasn't enough for people, and they wanted. I don't really know what they wanted in that moment from him. And I think at some point there is I'm not someone who like defends Harry Maguire's form and things like that. But I think there is a kind of an unhealthiness that we're all responsible with, like as journalists, as people on social media, where we see a 5-10 second clip of something and straight away we want to react, right? I do it. Like I'll see something, I'll see it for like 10-15 seconds, and before I've even looked for context or background, you've got an opinion in your head, haven't you, of that person, of what they've said, about their character, about where they are in their life, and that's not nice. It's not nice. But that's kind of the world that footballers inhabit now.
It's what we all inhabit. I mean, the pace of... I had this conversation very briefly with Ian McIntosh, where he felt like, God, it feels like 20 years has evaporated. And I was like, well, I'll tell you why. It's because the pace of coverage has meant that in 2 years we've had enough content to fill the prior 20. And the pace of things just doesn't allow things to simmer. So you have to make snap judgments. If you don't, you're left behind. Or contextually, at least, it's going to take too long to sift through what you need to in order to get to the creamy goodness of the truth in the center. But that's something that, I mean, the point you made there about, the fans' interest versus a journalistic interest, that must be difficult to balance as well, because in between those two things, you've got your own personal interest. Like, I have something I would quite like to ask you in this situation that has no journalistic benefit and no fan benefit, but then you try and curtail that as much as you can because you're a professional. But I guess the question, the easy question to ask is, I mean, money no objective, time no objective. Who would you interview and why?
I'd love to interview Roman Abramovich.
I'm so happy you said that. Oh my God, that's a good answer. And why? Let's see if he can stick the dismount.
Yeah. Well, I just think like he's never really done an interview.
Right. Exactly.
Right? So that's I always think the biggest, and I do think you were just saying there about like you're thinking as a journalist or you're thinking as a fan, and that actually, or you're thinking about what you yourself might want to ask separately from being a journalist or a fan, and that then made me think about, well, what is my kind of sense of self in that thing? And probably instinctively it's more the journalist side anyway. So one of the things I think, hopefully I don't sound completely arrogant here, but one of the things I think I'm quite good at is knowing what an audience wants to know and wants to read about. I think I have like quite good ideas and a good sense of what people are interested in. So I think that helps, and I do think that's one of those things that you either have or you don't have to a certain extent, and that is kind of nourished by reading everything and watching everything and being a bit obsessive about news cycles and things like that. But Abramovich, someone asked me this about before he left Chelsea, even before sort of Russia invaded Ukraine and everything, and I said Abramovich then. So it's not just the fact he's become a sanctioned Russian businessman and can't was forced out of English football and has sort of become blacklisted in many ways in the UK. But I was always just fascinated by him, because it always seemed to me that he had a lot of questions that needed to be answered, and there was a lot of things that, even very basic things, that I was very curious to see how he would answer. Why did you actually buy Chelsea? He's never really answered that. What was your reason for buying Chelsea? How much fun was it for you to run Chelsea? Or was it just like something that you needed as a base in the UK because you're a high profile Russian businessman? And
I would have loved to have seen you put that to him in exactly that cadence. Like, let's just casually chat. Did you do it to sports wash? I'm just asking questions.
But the amazing thing is, like, these are questions that we can ask
Exactly.
until 7 or 8 months ago, because
Mm.
of, you know, one of the things that happened after everything sort of emerged, where he was sanctioned and all the fallout, was people were saying, like, why didn't people write more about it? Why didn't people ask more questions? And to a large extent, that was because it was very difficult legally when
Right.
you're dealing with an individual. So one of the things about, but then, now what would you ask him? It's probably an entirely different interview to what it was a year ago, right? Like, a year ago, it's probably a discussion about Chelsea to a large extent. He was the owner of the European champions, and I think everyone kind of had a sense, what is the relationship with Putin? What are the links with, like, the Russian government and things like that? But he never really got a load of sort of questions, did he? I don't think. I think it was pretty...
He only ever gave one official interview when he bought Chelsea, didn't he?
Exactly. So, there were some very, very good books written. But in terms of, when people were writing about Chelsea for the last 10 years or so, it wasn't written with, like, the caveats that you now see about Paris Saint-Germain or Newcastle or Manchester City, or things like that. He'd almost been accepted in the end as part of English football's ecosystem. So yeah, I mean, if you're with him now, the questions are, there's so much, right?
Exactly. And how do you whittle it down to something that is as it gets to the nub of the issue rather than dances around it for a period of time, and also you don't want to then not humanize, but you don't want to come across as vitriolic in the situation. You just want to be seen to be, look, I just want answers to questions. I'm not here to make you the villain of this pantomime, but if your answers aren't great, the chips fall where they may, to a certain degree.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think there's that much value in being vitriolic or, I'm right, you're wrong kind of thing in an interview. It's just about asking questions and giving and them giving answers, and then you challenging them on those answers. He's not going to be doing an interview with me, so this is all very, very...
we live in very strange times, though, Adam. We live in incredibly strange times.
So I'd say, apart from him, there's Joel Glazer would be an amazing interview, as someone who doesn't give interviews. Any of these owners, right? None of them really give interviews. I think they'd all be fascinating because they are super rich, not used to taking questions, not used to being held directly accountable by media or by state, or they're probably used to questions from investors, which are very different constituencies and stakeholders to sort of media and football supporters. It was one of the things that became so clear, right, during the Super League, that you had 6 English clubs that went into it, but there was no single owner of one of those 6 English clubs that possessed the combination of charisma and credibility to be the front man to sell their vision of why this is a good idea, right? Because actually, it's not an argument I agree with, but there was an argument to be made, right? If you are Manchester United or Arsenal or Liverpool, you can make an argument, and again, as I say, it's not one I necessarily agree with, but you can make an argument. You've got clubs that are funded by funds that are linked to nation states, whether that's Manchester City or PSG, and they have such huge resources that eventually we're going to bankrupt ourselves trying to keep up with them. Now, that's an argument that's full of holes, right? Manchester United have spent a fortune on transfers over the past decade and still managed to fall behind. Barcelona did very similar. But there's something in it, and there's a way that could have been sold and argued, I think, to the public over time. I think the idea of a closed league would never really wash with British football fans, but I think it probably would have done with Spanish football fans, Italian football fans. maybe German and French. Bayern Munich are always in the Champions League anyway, so what difference does it really make? Yeah, I'm talking as if I'm them here.
Yeah, you could. From their perspective, they're selling it as almost an evolution of the sport. This is, look, all these clubs have reached a pinnacle. It's almost not fair for us to compete with everybody else. So let's just. You can understand the argument, but as you've said, it's machine gunned with holes as far as the sporting element of what football is supposed to be at the end of the day, which is an incredibly simplistic child's game that is, has been honed and perfected and invested into the point where it's become almost this vicarious way that people live through their superheroes. Their youthfulness and their exuberance and their abilities and the moments that they craft and the legacies they leave. But that's all thrown away the second you go, yes, but have you thought about how much money we could make, though?
Yeah.
It just seems to be a little bit antithetical to what, when I was in the football pitch learning to play football, I was asked, when you're a striker, do you want to play like Shearer or Owen? Not, which financial investment opportunity would you be more interested in, this one or this one? And you go, well, I'm personally, in favour of long-term favouritis. Then your players, it just wasn't a thing, you know what I mean? So I do appreciate the nature of having to pose that kind of question to a Glazer or an Abramovich, or even, if you could get a hold of someone from the PIF and sit them down and say, listen, guys, what you doing? That would be. I love the fact that from not from an aggressive perspective, but you have gone straight for the interviewing juggler there. You've not gone for, I'd love to speak to Maradona and ask him how he did a rebut. No, Glazer, come on then, sit down, let's talk.
You know what? This is a terrible thing. This probably football fans, if they watch this, who hate this answer. I wouldn't be that. I don't think I'd be that excited about, sitting down with like a Zidane or a.
But don't you think that's because you're not going to sit there and go what most football fans would do, which is, hey, do you remember when you volleyed that goal in the final? Wasn't that brilliant? Because what's he going to say? Yeah, it was great. No. Like, there's not much that can be extracted from that. You know what I mean?
I think there are a lot of football journalists who have a greater. So, for example, I don't love going to football matches. Right, my passion is more the journalism than the sport itself, and what I love is the characters and the personalities and 100%. The storylines and the narratives, and this is happening. Why is it happening? Who wants it to happen? What's going to happen? Those are the things that really excite me. Almost like
you're 95% of all professional wrestling fans and Marvel movie fans today. That no interest in the actual product, just who's making it, why, what are the gold. Like, that's the nub of what they love. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I might be overthinking, but I do think, like, I'm 28 and grew up in a very, in a I suppose an era that was incredibly personality led, right? So you've got like the 90s and 2000s, and I do think I was listening to a podcast actually today with Marina Hyde from the Guardian, which probably shows how middle class my podcast taste currently is. It was actually, I think it was Ed Miliband talking to Marina Hyde on his podcast. But that's giving me away. But they was it them? I think it was that. I can't remember if it was this podcast or a different podcast. Anyway, the podcast I was listening to, and they were arguing that this, like, growing up in this like reality TV generation of the 90s and 2000s, of being fascinated by celebrity culture and reality TV culture.
That's interesting, because one of the tweets that I picked up, because the two ways, just for people, full disclosure, my exposure to you came in two waves. First, you were good company on my Saturday and Sunday mornings when I used to work overtime at a place I worked, because of your participation in something called the Sunday Supplement, where you would make appearances, and on the one occasion I have clipped of you, y'all don't have any food on your plates for the first time I've ever seen. And I always wondered, as a panelist on those shows, how annoying is it when they put the pretense of it as a breakfast, but then they make you talk about, on this particular edition, the possibility of a European Super League, which is already complicated and convoluted enough, and also the passing of Leicester City's chairman at the time. Like, guys, we don't have to pretend like we're going to have breakfast here. This is pretty heavy subject matter. We should probably just focus on discussing it to the best of our abilities.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, Sunday Supplement doesn't exist anymore. I don't know if that's linked to me sort of going on it a couple of times.
No!
In its later stages. I only did it, I think, 2 or 3 times. It's very fun. It's the sort of thing that, like, my dad's friends would get very excited about. And you, clearly.
Listen, I can't tell you what a relief it was seeing the full thing go up on a Sunday at some stage and then going, cool, I've got company for an hour while I'm wading through, I don't even know what I was working on at the time. But the point is that I remember seeing you on the Sunday Supplement and being incredibly, just very forthright. I think some of the guys that went on there were acutely aware of the fact that they were on television and had a bit of a bravado about them, or had it almost a presentation. Henry Winter used to get me because he just had this very straight presentation. It would never quite look at the camera and always sort of lean away from it, as if like he was trying to deny the audience, no, you cannot see me. Whereas you just sort of, well, let me think for a second, and you presented as such. And I just thought you came across very articulately and very eloquently.
But the funny thing about that, I was actually I think I was on with Henry on one occasion, and he was very helpful, because I'd only done it like once, I think, before. But what I do remember is I don't know if it was that same episode or the one you're talking about, but there was one episode I did where it would have been around the time where you wear poppies.
Yes, yeah.
And I had a suit on, and about 30 seconds before the start of the show, the pin just came out.
Okay.
And I remember the producers literally running on. And as you can hear, 10, 9, 8, 7, like trying to get this in, couldn't get it in. So in the end, I had to have it like inside the pocket, almost poking out. And what it meant was I couldn't actually move my body position for this like 18-minute segment of the show. So I'm therefore surprised that I wouldn't have come across. Maybe if it was a podcast, it was okay. But certainly if I was on TV, I would have just looked like this, static, for 17 minutes, scared to move in case it looked like I was disrespecting sort of 100 years of history. So no, that can be quite funny, like the reality of TV. The food is real. Food is real. You don't want to be the person who's like got crumbs around their mouth when they're about to talk, do you?
But isn't that the benignity of television panel shows, where it's set up like you're almost dropping in on someone in their living room when they've got company, but no one's eating. Maybe someone has a sip of whatever's in their cup, Horlicks, John Smith's, whatever happens to be in the cup that day. But like no one ever eats. Like, why would you put it there? It's just this big glaring weird thing in the middle of a panel show, especially when, like, again, the gist of the Sunday Supplement at the time was to we want some of the best journalists. We want them to talk about the stories of the week. We want them to give us some insight. We'd like them to articulate the stories, but we need you to get it done in about a minute, 2 minutes, maybe, if you've got something to say about it. And the question I had was, considering that obviously you've now transitioned fully into the long format, of podcasting, you'll do, long format interviews, you write consistently, you've written a book that I would love to talk to you about, assuming we have time. How have you found that transition? Was it kind of a breath of fresh air to being able to go, right, we can talk for as long as we need to, or as much as we want to, as opposed to, right, I have to condense what I have to say to make sure I hit the point that I need to make? And that's a challenge, and that becomes enjoyable. Is there a dichotomy there, or is it just nice to be able to just say what you have to say?
You mean in terms of there being like a time limit to how long you can speak?
I guess so, yeah, because I know television is heavily produced. So, like you said, there's no one there when the poppy pin falls out that goes, "Oh, it's okay, we'll just find another pin. Okay, just give it another minute, guys." As opposed to,
well,
rush him.
That show was live. Sunday Supplement. So, you're conscious of. I mean, the great thing about that show was as a guest, you don't really have to do very much. You know, the person who's doing all the hard work was the presenter at the time was Neil Ashton. He's the guy doing the hard work there. And it looks so and the best people make it look so easy, right? So when you're watching at home, you're just like, oh, that's just the presenter. It's like when people now watch, Sky on a Sunday, and David Jones, and there'll be weekends where you barely think about David Jones when you're watching, even though you're watching him for 5-6 hours and he's in your living room. I mean this very affectionately because I think he's incredible at what he does. But there is such a skill to having someone in your ear who is producing, who is giving you, saying, oh, we've got a break in this long, you need to wrap this up here, you need to move it onto here, you need to move it onto that, we need to get through this issue, we've not covered that issue yet. Like, it's really tough. And often, they'll be doing it outside as well, where you've got all the crowd around you and things like that. So yeah, as a guest, I think that that's kind of like the easier part. It's a bit like, podcasts that we'll now do, or if I do 5 Live Monday Night Club sometimes when Rory Smith doesn't do it. And, Mark Chapman will say, Mark Chapman's the presenter, and he might say to me at the end, oh, well done. And it's like, you don't really feel like you're doing that much, because really all I have to do is give an opinion, right? Give an opinion, have a bit of fun with the other guys who are on. But the real skill of broadcasting is the presenting, and is making it tick and making the listener comfortable with everyone who they are hearing, right? So that everyone feels included and things like that. Because there's times, right, you can watch TV and you can watch some channels and you'll see like a pundit, you can tell like they don't click in that group. And it's not always the pundit's fault. Sometimes it can be it's the presenter not being inclusive enough, or the pundits not being inclusive enough. Jamie Redknapp gets a lot of stick. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, whatever. But one of the things he's absolutely brilliant at, particularly of like when pundits just start, is saying, hey, what do you think about that? When he finishes a point. He was really good at it when I think it was when Karen Carney was starting on Sky a while ago. He'd finish his point and say, do you agree with that, Karen? Right? To make the audience, everyone sort of feel part of it. And
especially to help legitimize someone who's not familiar with the audience, and that's something we all face when we're on a new platform for the first time. It's who are you and why are you here? When someone else comes in and says, what do you know? I think what you're about to say is worth listening to. What do you think? It just helps endorse an audience to them. So yeah, that's incredibly useful.
Yeah, I think there's something very, very strong about a generous host or pundit, or guest that is able to make others feel comfortable.
We're short on time, so I have to ask you the hardest hitting, the most impactful, the best question that I possibly can. So instead, I'm going to surmise. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you was because if you look at your career, and this is where I start to hate you, is that if I wrote something as a piece of witty commentary here, where did I put it? I put it here somewhere. Where is it? And I must read it so that everyone knows how clever I am. Here we go. Let's talk about your accolades, because they're like the rising chart positions of songs from an Ed Sheeran album, and that they're numerous and creeping concerningly always to the top spots. Your accomplishments, every single year, you seem to be nominated, shortlisted, or win awards for journalism. You have written a book that is exceedingly well received and praised for its detail and its nuance and its particularly unique perspective. You have garnered a reputation on The Athletic as one of the best writers by far. And again, having seen your appearances on podcasts, on the Sunday Supplement, on various other platforms, you've obviously got a ability to be able to present yourself without losing any of that ability to get to the nub of these issues and articulate these issues. I guess what I want to ask, and especially consider, again, the fact that you speak a number of languages and you studied them extensively, and you still don't give yourself credit when you go to countries and go, yes, but the accent is a little different, so it's a bit difficult to... Listen, you do a lot better than 99% of us, trust me. My question is, How would you summarize your career thus far in terms of what your aspirations were when you started and where you want to ideally end up?
Thank you. That's very kind.
It's all in writing. For you can listen. You want to go to LinkedIn? I'm not just kissing his ass. Look, there's
Yeah, but who
one,
writes the
two,
LinkedIn
three,
post?
four,
Could be
five,
made
six
up.
awards just off here, and I'm sure there's more that they've not published. You've got a million awards. I've got one award that I gave myself for being good. That's the only award I've ever been given. It has first on it, but only because I took the second place sticker and put first place on it. Anyways, your aspirations when you started to where you are, because those can change through time. Obviously, when you see what the possibilities are, and you have setbacks, you have progressions. Like how do you see yourself now versus when you started, and where you ultimately want to put yourself?
Yeah, I mean, when I started, I didn't set out like thinking I want to be this, right? And it was really just I, I'd never really thought about being a journalist as a kid. I suppose the only thing that I did do, like I did, looking back, like I did, but I was like a 12-year-old kid buying newspapers. That's quite weird. Um, to be fair, like I would, before I would get the school, I'd walk to the bus stop in the morning, and I would always like buy a couple of papers and just read the sports pages on the bus on the way to school. Um, so that I suppose was a bit of a sign, but that was more like as a football fan. I wanted to know what was going on, and I wanted to be able to like tell people in the playground, no, they're going to sign him. No, they're going to sign him. They're going to get him. They're going to get him. He's going to get sacked, and pretend that I'd come up with it, and that I just knew was a 12-year-old. But then when I was about 16, I went in on work experience to the Daily Mail for the first time. I was really lucky that a friend of mine at school had started a blog, and when they first started it, they said, "Oh, Adam, why don't you write something? You like football as well. So it's not just me that's doing it." And I said, I basically, I think, just took the piss out of him and was like, "Get a life, let's just go and play instead of writing about it." And anyway, so eventually I did, and I think like one of the first pieces I wrote, I sent it to Lee Clayton, who was head of sport at the Daily Mail at the time, and he let me go in. He gave me back like probably a 1,000 word email. I've still got it somewhere, actually, just with loads of advice and feedback. And he basically ended the email saying, if you ever fancy coming in for the week to see, if you want to see what it's like in a newsroom, what the kind of things that we do on sport, then come in. And I was lucky because I grew up in Manchester, but I have an uncle that lives in London. And for people who don't have family in London, work experience in journalism is really, really difficult if you aren't financially comfortable, because it's expensive, right? You're talking expensive trains, expensive hotels, and even just to have an opportunity like that, you need that certain level of luck or privilege to be able to make the most of it. So I went in for a week, and I just loved it. I loved being part of a newsroom, seeing how it worked, hearing sort of sports editors talk to each other, say, deciding what was going to be in the paper that day, hearing them on the phone to reporters who were feeding them back, telling them, I've heard this, and then you see the buzz in the newsroom because they know that they've got something that's going to be great the next day, and they're coming up with ideas. And I was lucky, like there was people there, the person who's my boss now, Alex Kajowski, was actually the first person who met me on my first day of work experience and took me up to the office. Like,
Wow.
That's a pretty crazy thing. And as Lee, who was head of sport there, gave me a huge amount of opportunities. I kept going back, and yeah, like a lot of that initially is, I think a few of those weeks, like probably maybe I covered a train fare or something like that, and yeah, I wasn't necessarily making money out of it, but I was like, I was still at school, and then I was at university. So for me, it was just like, it was a huge amount of fun. And and I was in a position where I could afford to do it. So it was never a case of I'm 16 and I want to be Henry Winter, or I want to be Paul Hayward, or I want to be Martin Samuel. All amazing, amazing at their jobs. I kind of just wanted to keep being me as I went along, and what you realize is, one, like you can't like pretend to be someone else. I remember when I was about 17, 18, I went through a stage of like trying to write like Johnny Liu, right? I can't write like Johnny Liu, right? No one can write like Johnny Liu. But I remember like reading all his pieces and like sitting there, like when I would be writing a piece, trying to come up with like a turn of phrase or that little bit of flourish of a Paul Hayward, a Johnny Liu, I suppose Marina Hyde, Martin Samuel, these wonderful, colourful writers that are really writers, right? Like people say people sometimes say they're a sports writer. No, they are sports writers, right? They are the writers. The rest of us might be reporters or journalists. I think Martin, to be fair, he's all of them. He's a reporter, he's a writer, he's a journalist. But there's some people that are writers in the most beautiful sense of the word. So as I went along, I was looking, okay, so what can I do that's different? And one of the things that I could do was speak languages. And
indeed, yeah.
And I'd studied languages at school. I was then studying French and Spanish at university, and it meant that I would have a year abroad. So I'd have 6 months to study in Spain, 6 months to study in France. And I used that time to, I would send ideas to the sports desk at the Daily Mail and say, why don't I go and do like the backstory of David De Gea's life? This is like 2014 when he's sort of really starting to emerge. I'll go and speak to his old PE teacher, his coaches, his best friends, anyone who's ever worked with him basically in Madrid, and do that. And what I found was that I just started building contacts and relationships, and I found that agents and players would be that not always, but like that 10% more receptive if you're writing to them in their own language, and they know that you're British as well. Like it feels like you're making a bit of an effort. It doesn't always work, yeah. But there was an advantage. So that was like one way that I was able to stand out. That's where the book came in a little bit as well. And then as I kind of grew with experience, you start to discover it might be different skills, or it might be different experiences. And I don't know. Am I answering your questions?
Yeah, no, 100%. Because you're walking me through where you started in terms of, look, I walked in there a knucklehead. I didn't know that this was what I wanted, but I saw something that ignited something in me. I wanted to pursue it. I had random circumstances where I was able to exploit my unique circumstances to be able to garner, and suddenly you end up where you are. But like you're saying, like the kind of the path you're leading here is that you're making the most of the opportunities that you have. You're not trying to go, no, that's not the opportunity I want. No, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm here. I'm learning a language. While I'm here, I might as well utilize this unique, because you were unique. Like you said, you were uniquely placed. You were aware of the fact that you had an opportunity rather than kind of letting it pass you by.
Yeah, I suppose so. I've never thought about it like that. But then I suppose as it went along, I then become, I suppose, different experiences and things like, I remember, for example, actually when I was living in France, Neil Ashton, who I mentioned before, was at doing the Sunday supplement, but he was working at the Mail at the time. And it was, I think, the 20th anniversary of Eric Cantona's Kung Fu Kick. And he'd been asked to try and find Eric in Paris, in the village where he lives, to try and get an interview, 20 years on, see if he'd talk about it. And if he wouldn't talk about it, then, worst case, like you do like a nice colour feature piece about the area where he lives and what's his life like now, and speak to some people that know him and that kind of thing. And I was kind of asked to go along to like help with because I spoke French, to meet him, and I was living in Paris at the time as well. And I that experience was really useful because I could learn from Neil there in terms of how does he go about that process of basically trying to find a famous person, right? And what were his processes and his ways of doing it and things like that. And that was really useful for me probably 3 years later when I get a call from my boss saying Diego Costa's on strike at Chelsea. I don't know if you remember, he fell out with Antonio Conte.
Got the famous text message from Conte at the beginning of the season saying, "You're not part of my plans," basically.
Yeah, saying you're not part of our plans, and he basically just spent the summer in Brazil.
Yeah, baffling move, but fair play.
Yeah, and it was the first week of the season, and I remember my boss calling me saying, "Do you want to go and try and find him?" And I was like,
shake your head like, what do you mean go find him?
I was like, what, in the middle of Brazil? And if you take that really, really broad idea of how do I find a single person in this huge continent that probably doesn't want to be found, then it's a really scary prospect. But when you then start to say, okay, like, let's try and make a plan. And what's that plan? So I remember I spoke to a player that I knew at Chelsea at the time, and I said, are you sure he won't come back? Because I don't want to fly out there if he's going to be on the reverse plane.
Can you imagine?
Exactly. And this player said, no, he's definitely staying there. I spoke to him today, so I was like, cool. And then it's about what local knowledge can you find? So there was like local news reports of him living in his small village. Him going to like a local futsal team to give out some awards and stuff like that. So I got in touch with the futsal team, and they put me in touch with like a local radio journalist in the town, and I agreed to meet up with that local journalist when I was there, because I was thinking, okay, if I don't get this interview, I'm going to build a piece about what's his life like in this town to make sure we get something. And once I get there, it's a really small village, and this thing that seems impossible from 5,000 miles away, all of a sudden becomes the journalist saying to me, well, if you turn left here, turn right there, take a left, walk for 5 minutes, that's where he lives. I'll come with you, we'll knock on the door, I'll say that we've met for 20 minutes and you're all right, and maybe you've got half a chance. And I was lucky. That's probably, for whatever people might say about things that I've done at the Athletic and stuff like that, still, like, without doubt, like, the thing I've done that I'm probably most proud of, the thing I've done that probably industry wise had the biggest impact was probably that interview where you have a player who is on strike, who doesn't want to be interviewed, where it's a genuine exclusive interview that everyone's following up for the next week, and that was experience. But my ability to make a plan came from that previous experience 3 years before, where I'm just sort of watching someone older and wiser and better go about their process.
Possibly, but I think you're using your own natural, because you strike me as the kind of person that just sort of takes everything in stride. I've never seen you flabbergasted or dumbfounded in an interview I've ever seen you do. So, but that speaks to, again, the innate nature. But
I think that's if you ask like friends or family or people that I've dated, and they will say like they are sometimes alarmed that I'm never really high or low.
Right.
And it means I kind of have this like very, very steady mentality. And this makes me sound really wanky and like an athlete, where you're saying like, after a win you don't want to be too high, and after a defeat you shouldn't be too low. But really, and this is what I'm going to say next makes me sound even worse, but that idea of as soon as that's done, like the way that the news cycle works, it's that old saying of like it's tomorrow's chip paper, right?
Yes, right.
And you can't live off something you've done like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when there's so much every day to be finding out, and that's the most exciting part of the job. It's the breadth of people that you end up speaking to who have really interesting lives and stories and things like that, but also just the breadth of stories. Like the amount of stuff that happens in sport is just ridiculous.
The stuff that happens and the perspectives as well,
Yeah.
because for everything that happens, there's everyone looking at it from a slightly different perspective with a slightly different predilection that gives it slight caveats and flavors. I would say, yes, I don't see your energy levels dip and surge. I will say, this was perfectly encapsulated in a tweet that I screen grabbed for this. David Beckham believes the timing of the Club World Cup may benefit England as backed them to succeed. Quote, even if it is a genuinely held view, surely any comments Beckham makes in relation to contentious aspects of this World Cup must inform the audience he is being paid by the state hosting it. ... He still looks great though, obs. I thought that was brilliant. Just the idea of, listen, okay, from an objective perspective, let's look at what he's saying carefully. But now that that's out of the way, God, isn't he gorgeous? Like, it was just, that was so funny to me how, because that social media balance of presence of your job as a journalist, your job as a reporter, but also, listen, man, I'm just going to give you my 2 cents on this as well. He does look good in a suit, doesn't he? And like, because that's the complexity of sport. It could be analysed logically and coldly and with a calculation, but ultimately it's about people. Like you say, it's about stories, it's about legacy, it's about history, it's about the tapestry it all weaves, and the impression it makes on people. And I think you captivate that very, very well, especially considering how bloody young you are. 28, and the career you've had. Absolute mick take.
No, but I think that's what I meant though about when I said that. I think the thing that I'm best at is kind of, I do think I'm quite good at knowing
where that line is between the
what the
audiences.
conversation is that people will be having, if that makes sense.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
So
yeah.
Like when David Beckham's on TV in Qatar or whatever at the World Cup, I think people will be saying, "Oh, that's a bit, that's a bit questionable." But God, what is he, 50? And he looks like that. That's what people will be saying. It is. Like you can pretend, like you can kind of like try and be like ultra serious about it, but like that's the conversation
that's how it would go down in the pub. 100%. There'd be one bloke across the way saying it the one way, and then another bloke or another lady or someone else in the corner going, "Yeah, but doesn't he look good? Doesn't he look good for 50 years old?"
It's okay to think both things at the same time.
100%. 100%.
In the same way, it's okay to think at the same time, like, do Newcastle's owners have some very big questions to answer, but at the same time also think, wow, Eddie Howe's done pretty well, in the job that he's done, and those players that they're signing are pretty good, and they're getting the recruitment right, and it's like when they're now, I think they're going to be hosting some games with the women's team at St James's Park. Now, there'll be some people who look at that and just say, that's sports washing, right? That's sports washing because, when you look at the way that women are treated back home in Saudi Arabia, but we want to try and look good in the UK, therefore we're going to spend money and give opportunities to women in the Northeast. Okay. But my take on that is slightly different. It's, yeah, okay, there might be a cynical objective. We don't know. We don't know the cynical. We don't know what someone is thinking, and we can't ask them because they don't take questions. Okay, so people can make a judgment, right? What it's also okay to say at the same time is, for a long time, that opportunity has not been there.
It's women in the Northeast not having the opportunity, and now they do.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think one of the things that I think I need to probably be better at is the way that I maybe go about this issue on Twitter to a certain extent, because I think there's probably a lot of Newcastle fans who think, I just think absolutely everything to do with with the ownership and the club is negative, and that's not the truth. I've also never ever told Newcastle supporters how they should feel about.
But you can only focus on so much. Like if you wrote a story that encapsulated every feasible perspective, you'd have a bloody Bible that you'd be selling every single week. And the fact that every opinion can't be undermined with another opinion, at that point, guys, you're engaging in whataboutism. At what point is my opinion taken on its own merit and in its own individual spectrum? If you want to argue with the merits of the argument I'm putting forward, or in this case you're putting forward, that's fine. Argue that particular point. But you can't say, oh, so you think, because at that point you're inserting something else that's completely irrelevant to that point of the conversation. At which point we're arguing past each other. At that point we're not having the same discussion.
Yeah. And look, my view is, and the thing, what I've written about Newcastle actually has never been my view, right? It's always been reporting, which
of course, yeah, that's your job. But that's your job, so
which is different. And if you are asking my view, which you've not, but I'm going to give it you anyway, it's that what maybe annoys me at times is where you have a situation where the takeover happens, and at the time people are saying, this will be an opportunity to have questions asked and an opportunity to engage and have dialogue and to build cultural relationships and all of this kind of stuff. But then as you go along, because the team's winning a few games and some good transfers come, those questions become harder and harder to be asked, and it reaches the point where actually you really can't say anything now about Newcastle's owners without 10 people coming back at you on Twitter and saying, "You're obsessed. How dare you? How dare you? How dare you?" Actually, well, no, these are reasonable questions.
You're the guy trying to tell us at 14 or 15 years old, that energy drink that you're drinking, it'll give you kidney stones and it'll give you diabetes. I don't want to hear that from you. They're £2 for £1, mate. And have you tasted them? They're brilliant. All you're doing is, no, hang on, there's a negative element here, and it has to be considered because it's part of the equation of what you're enjoying. In the same way, and I feel your pain from the perspective of that, my disillusionment with wrestling, for instance, came when WWE proceeded with their Jeddah shows despite the murder of Kamal Khashoggi. And it was one of those situations where the world was watching. And it was, you have the ability to do the right thing here, guys. I get you've been paid a lot of money, and there's contracts and considerations, and there's wider ramifications. But the right thing to do here is to not proceed with the show. They proceeded with the show anyway, and at that point it becomes, oh, you keep bringing this point up. Yes, but it's an exceedingly important point. Someone was murdered. Like, I'm sorry, your enjoyment matters very little to me when balanced against the value of a human life. My entertainment is not that. It's not that important comparatively, and that's why I mean when you said what stories do you want covering during the Qatar World Cup, one of the things I tweeted you was, listen, don't ever let the exceedingly high cost of human life and resources be put under the carpet for what is effectively a winter's entertainment. That, listen, I can just watch Jingle All the Way on repeat. It's fine. Don't need a World Cup. Got Jingle All the Way, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, and The Grinch. Sorted. Do you know what I mean?
Well, so your position is to not watch it.
My position is probably, yeah. I unsubscribed from the WWE network and I haven't partaken in a single WWE product since. Only because, even though they're under new management and the person ultimately responsible for the decision has been outed as a sex criminal, the point is that I stand on principle on this, because I believe in an age where it's very easy to just point at something else and say, yes, but that's worse, so I can justify my own fandom. But no, everything has to be judged on its own merit. Is it bad or good? on its own, not compared to something else. You compare it to something else in terms of a grade. How bad is it? Is this as bad as this? That I've got no problems with. But from the perspective of a company made a decision that I fundamentally and morally disagree with, and if I discovered, look, I'm an lifelong Arsenal football fan. If I discovered that there was something fundamentally wrong with the structure of that club and the people leading it, I'd drop them in a heartbeat, because it's an entertainment venue at some point. At some point, your values and morals have to matter in the way that shareholders and stakeholders seem to think they do when they pull their commercial advertising rights for something that they say, oh, this is morally objectionable. Well, to who? Because apparently the same people that find this morally objectionable, whatever the thing happens to be, are the same people that are going to look the other way when it comes to their entertainment, when it comes to, look, I know it's bad, but I do like this bit of it, so I'll just kind of turn a blind eye to it to a certain degree. And that's where I have to draw my own line and say, my entertainment is not that crucial to me that I can afford to look at it through a moral prism of, well, swings and roundabouts. It's, no, that's wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. So don't. It's that simple.
No, that's for like each and every person, isn't it? Right, to make their decision.
100%.
It's a really interesting one, because it's like we all have a plan until we're punched in the face.
100%.
We all have principles until the sacrifice becomes personal.
Yes, exactly. Right? Which virgin are we bringing to the volcano today? Wait, it's me. Do you know what? I'm not sure about this religion business anymore. Yeah, 100%.
Right, and that's an interesting one. Like, I have people say to me, like, what are you doing going to the World Cup? I'll be there the full 31 days of the World Cup, and how do I justify that? Well, I justify it because, one, it's my job to cover football, and it's the World Cup, and
plus you don't have a moral arbiter that you have to answer to. It's like you say, it's your own moral compass that's guiding you in this situation. If you found it particularly questionable, you wouldn't go, but you can look at it and say, listen, I understand the circumstances, but notwithstanding that, there's other factors that have to go into the equation here.
Yeah, and look, I mean,
you're an adult ultimately. You can make a nuanced perspective on something.
Yeah, and actually to be honest, I think if I'd have said that I don't feel safe going or things like that, then I wouldn't have had to go. But I think my view is that one of the things I'm conscious of is I've been to Qatar once, 4 or 5 years ago for something else, and it was a very short time I was in the country, and everyone's almost got a view of it before it's happened, before we've been there, and I understand it, because a lot of things have happened, a lot of things are alleged to have happened. Some of the answers probably haven't been sufficient in quite a lot of cases as well. Whether that's in regards to the treatment of migrant workers, whether that's in regards to treatment of women or LGBTQ rights, whatever pick your poison. But what I did really want to do is meet Qatari people.
Yes.
That's something that I really, really want to do, in the same way as I'd love to go to Saudi Arabia and meet Saudi Arabian people.
Yes.
Because I wasn't at the World Cup in Russia in 2018. That engagement is an interesting thing. I also think there's a lot of things that I want to report about. There'll be a lot of journalists at this World Cup who will go, and because it's their job, this doesn't make them better or worse or anything like that. Because it's their job, they'll go and they'll write about football, right?
Of course.
Because that's what they are expected to do. And it's also, it makes me laugh when football fans go on about this. They'll say, "Oh, you'll ignore all these issues." Sometimes that's based on what people are reading.
Yep.
What people want to read, right? I'm not saying that everything that companies do is based on what the customer wants, but of course, there's, to a certain extent, there's a relationship, and then there's also things you do because it's morally right to do it, right? And there's things you do because it's a very good journalistically interesting thing to do. So there's certain like reports, investigations that I want to do when I'm there. I don't yet know how they'll turn out. Whether I have an idea of what some of those things may be, but as with anything, like it changes as you go along, as you speak to people, stuff like that. I don't know how easy it will be to do some of the stuff that I'd like to do, because you're going to have like the whole world in one city for a month. So I just think it'll be really interesting, right? And it is a fascinating moment of time. But I also understand those who simply say that they don't like the way that the competition was decided in the first place to be given to Qatar. There'll be people who say, that then they don't like, the idea of watching football in stadiums where workers have been, not at best, not given good working conditions. At worst, if you take the line of the Guardian article that said 6,500 people have died, which is countered by the Qataris who say it was only 3. And that's a difficult, and it's also another thing. Like that's a difficult thing at the moment as a journalist, because if you speak to, for example, the International Labour Organization, the ILO, which is like the trade union that's now based they now have headquarters in Qatar, have helped to change the laws around working conditions, which is positive. The implementation's not been as good, but the law changes are positive. But if you speak to them, but then if you speak to other organizations like Amnesty International or Fair Square or Human Rights Watch, you kind of get different numbers and different versions of events. And as a journalist, in the middle of that, that's quite difficult because I'm not there. I've not seen it firsthand, and you're then who do you listen to? My instinct is, because I think people have a lot of respect for organisations like Amnesty International, Fair Square, and Human Rights Watch, that you take their evidence very, very seriously. At the same time, the International Labour Organization has a very good reputation, and they're arguing that there's been progress, and you have federations like the English FA and Dutch FA saying that they've been part of some working group and that they've seen some progress. Now, that makes it a more complicated situation than a lot of people want it to be. And there is a danger that you nuance it into submission, and therefore you don't really end up saying anything.
Right.
Which is a situation which I think, for example, I think the English Football Association is getting into that territory, where you go there and you're like, things aren't perfect in our country either, and there's been some progress in Qatar. We'd like there to be more progress, but we need to engage to make things better. And you're like, okay, but what have you said? What are we actually saying here? That because someone might disagree with Liz Truss on her politics, we therefore can't have a view on the politics of the Emir of Qatar. Because there are imperfections here, we can't mention anything here. Yeah, and then because ultimately, like, we're all hypocrites, right? We all care about certain things more than other things. That's the reality, right? Like, I am more passionate about LGBTQ rights because it is personal to me than I might be to certain other causes at certain times. That's normal, right? There is a nirvana situation where your solidarity is so strong that you are equally engaged with every single cause and affliction that affects anyone or any group, right? And I think if I was to ask you now, like, what do you think about that thing that's happened to that person, you'd say that's a bad thing, right?
Right.
But there's only so many things that you can have the kind of time and energy to devote yourself to, if that makes sense.
100%.
Right, and I think at times there is this sense from, particularly, I think it is more of a social media thing. It's like, but it's off social media now as well. It's something that you hear from like a lot of radio hosts and stuff like that say, oh, how can he talk about social justice on this thing if he's going to do that on another thing? And it's like,
Right.
well, okay, so then we get into a world where basically just no one says like anything ever, right? Because you would be able to go, I don't know, search my Twitter feed, and I'm sure there'll be things that I've not spoken about at certain times, right?
Yeah, it's stuff that you haven't spoken about. 99% of the world's topics, probably, because you're only one person,
Exactly.
and there's 7.5 billion people on the planet.
Exactly. And that's where I think when you're having like one-on-one conversations like this, that can be very explained and nuanced. But it's when it gets into the public sphere, and it's like, I don't know. I mean, there's an interesting conversation now going on about like Gary Neville, right? He's become very, very vocal and proactive on social justice, and he's become involved with the Labour Party, and at the same time, he wants a regulator in football and things like that. But he's also, I think he's announced that he'll be working for beIN Sport, the Qatari state-funded TV channel, at the World Cup. Now, is there a fair discussion to be had about whether it's a good idea for Gary Neville to do that?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Does the fact that Gary Neville's doing that mean that everything else he says about social justice should just be ignored and discounted? There are people now who would say yes. Personally, I think like we can all be grown up enough to say, well, I might agree with you on 7, 8 things out of 10, but maybe I don't agree with you on that one thing, right?
Who you are is irrelevant in the situation. It's what you are saying and the merits with which you are defining your argument that are the only considerations in any given argument that should be given any credence. But you're 100% right in that his platform, or the platform rather he's built for himself, inherently is going to draw criticism from contrarians alone. Just people naturally going, oh, you're popular. Oh, well, I don't like you then, because there must be something inherently wrong with you if you're popular. And then you get other interest groups, like you say, people that said, right, that's great, but what I think deserves more discussion is insert 100 different, ifs, ands, or buts. Whereas, I mean, to answer your, not you were looking for an answer, but the answer I would give is just always come at it from a human perspective and from a place of love and understanding. Try and always boil it back down to, what if it were you? Like, just remember we're all humans at the end of the day. You want to, you can more broadly define people and be more specific, but we're all people. Every single living person is just ultimately a person trying to make their way in the world. And if you can always understand it from the perspective of trust people to act in their own self-interest more often than not, and trust people to do what they think is right for them, and you can start to put together, right, they may be arguing from a perspective of what they perceive to be the truth, so are these people, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of those two perspectives. And it's up to me to try and find mine somewhere in there without becoming married to it. Look, this isn't the truth unless it's a quantifiable fact. It's something that a scientist could reprove and prove again if given the opportunity. That's the only thing that's sort of a definable fact. But like you say, the hypocritical nature of things, I mean, sometimes you've got to stub your toe to make progress. I mean, I referenced the WWE earlier. Their original series of shows, they weren't allowed to have female wrestlers on the roster, let alone performing in their usual attire. But the second group, they did allow women wrestlers in the progressive city of Jeddah. So, okay, we're making some progress. Now, I'm trying to think now. Again, the same problem in professional wrestling, MMA, as we do with football. An openly gay performer, I don't know if I know any. Not any that's currently performing, which, by the way, again, is one of those great taboos no one ever really talks about. It's like, we're all really progressive. Are you sure? Because there's not many gay footballers that feel comfortable saying that they're gay. So are you sure you're all-encompassing and all loving and cuddling? Or are you all still a little bit inwardly not that 100% comfortable with it? In which case, come on, we got to talk about that then. What exactly is your problem? So, seconded by, why the fuck is it your business in the first place? But, that's just my opinion on that. I have a gay housemate, and we have this argument constantly where his identity, I am not defined as a gay man. And I said, who's defining you as one? People constantly when they find out I'm a gay man. I'm like, man, if people only defined me as an Arsenal supporter when they found out I was an Arsenal supporter, that would get tiring quickly. Especially if they started to discriminate against me because of it. I can't walk into a shop because, oh, you like Dennis Bergkamp, do you? Get out. Like, okay, all right, fair enough. I did want to touch on that with you at some stage because of the delicate balance you have to strike as, you know, someone that has to speak their own piece, but at the same time report on things from an objective perspective. But you're arguing against, again, football fans are in the same bracket as MMA fans, I find, where they want the truth until it starts inhibiting the thing they're a fan of. So, you know, you get MMA fans who, you know, they want the truth about steroid use till their favorite fighter pops, in which case, no, we don't want to hear about steroids anymore. Football fans, we want to hear how progressive and great we are. We have an interview with a guy that's come out. I stick to covering the games. Like, I can't win sometimes. Do you know what I mean? It's either, you know, we're embracing everybody or we're not. Like, and until we can say that honestly, I don't know if we've made the progress we really think we've made. I mean, didn't Richarlison get a bloody banana thrown at him again the other day? And you think, I'm sick and tired of having this conversation, guys. Like, football's for everybody. It's literally for everybody. It's designed to be for everybody. Literally everybody. Blind people, deaf people, people with one leg, and of every disability, creed, colour, faith, everybody. Why is that such a hard concept to get your heads around? Went on a rant for no reason there, people. Sorry about that. I really am becoming a podcaster, aren't I? Incoherent ranting.
2 hours later.
But yeah, so I suppose I should ask you a question approaching something interesting. Your book. One of the questions I had was, obviously I've read the synopsis and I've read some of the praise that was heaped upon it, but what I wanted to know was, when you went in to write that book, did you go in hoping to find a conclusion? Or was it a case that you went in with a premise and you explored a concept to try and reach a factual conclusion? Considering some of the pieces that I've read about it, they go in different directions. So I guess what I wanted to know was, did you have something that guided you throughout the whole process, or did you have to sort of go where the information was taking you and then try and focus it back down to a singular point at the end?
Quite a long time ago now. But I think it was an exploration. I wasn't looking for a conclusion. It was quite a chronological exploration. Sorry for anyone who's watching who doesn't know what it's about. It's kind of about the story of Spaniards in English football, but it goes back to like the 1930s, 1940s, and starts with kind of child refugees that were fleeing from the Spanish Civil War and moved over on a boat from, I don't know if you've heard of the obviously the famous Picasso painting Guernica. So the bombings of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War, it was these children that moved from kind of the Basque part of Spain, northern Spain, on a boat to Southampton, and a handful of them became the first Spanish players to play in English football. And I kind of managed to track down their children and grandchildren and get hold of all their different sort of everything that they had kept and things like that. And they'd all, like, each of them had sort of incredible lives. One of them had gone on to sort of write the first document that was behind like the foundation of Barcelona's academy, that has obviously gone on to be
mildly successful,
yeah. And then it sort of all came through to the present day. Like, I was fortunate that a lot of people agreed to be interviewed, like David De Gea, Juan Mata, a lot of other people, sort of a lot of the like modern day Spanish players in Premier League football. And obviously there was that wave of Spaniards that came in to the game around when Spain won the World Cup in 2010, that kind of creative midfield player, and a lot about like what went into creating those players and how they were recruited, and then obviously also going into, you know, managers as varied as Benitez and Pep Guardiola, right? Like both Spanish. Pep would say he's Catalan. but very, very different in style and what that sort of tells us about the country and how that's changed over the years. So yeah, it was an exploration. It was quite fun. I've not done another book since. I don't think I will for a while, to be honest.
Was it quite a taxing process?
It was hard because I kind of did it it was like my final year uni and first year of work, full-time work, when I was doing it. And there was the hard thing about it was the number of interviews it required. So if you're doing a book where you're very, very reliant on other people and their timings and their schedules and all of that kind of thing, that's where the difficulty comes in, and the stress of it as well, because you've got, people who have nothing, someone like David Guernica that does an interview for that book has nothing to gain really from doing that, other than, being part. It's a nice thing for him to be a part of, quite a long lineage. Mikel Arteta at the time was a coach at Manchester City. It's still, I think, the only interview that he's done as a kind of sit-down interview since he became a coach, and even since he's gone to Arsenal. So that was like really interesting. But I was very reliant on when these people would be available. I remember there was one player that 3 times we'd agreed a date, never in England. So each time I was going somewhere, twice I got there, they were like, "Oh, we'll do it next time," kind of thing. And that's difficult. You also like working within a budget and all of that kind of thing. So yeah, it was fun. It was rewarding. The contacts that I made from it have become like very good contacts for me. People, it was weird, people like I interviewed Roberto Martinez for the book because he signed for Wigan in the mid 1990s, and it was funny because he was presented at the time in the local paper wearing a sombrero, even though he's Spanish rather than Mexican. And there was 3 Spanish players that were signed in like the 3rd division of English football, and they were staying at like a local hotel near Wigan, near Manchester. And every Friday night there'd be like a disco in the hotel, and they'd put the Macarena on, and the DJ would put the Macarena on and basically demand that the 3 Spanish players perform the Macarena in the mid 1990s. But I remember I went to see Roberto in near where he has a house in Ibiza, and this was only a few weeks, probably 7 or 8 weeks after he left Everton. So it was actually quite an interesting moment in his career, probably one of the more difficult moments in his career. But he's become someone who is I consider sort of a really good contact and a really good person to deal with. And then other people like Victor Orta, who's now the sporting director at Leeds. When I interviewed him for the book, he was actually working at Middlesbrough in the recruitment department, and obviously I can't say I could predict that he was going to go on to work in a very high-profile role at a big club, doing deals like this summer, signing players like Brendan Aronson, and having signed Rafinha and sold Rafinha, and getting Bielsa to Leeds and things like that. But I do remember coming away from that conversation thinking he's going to be useful. He's going to be useful because he is smart, and he's a bit different, and he's talented, and so it proved. So that was like the real value of that book to me, rather than anything from a kind of financial point of view. It was more the relationships and contacts that I was able to develop as a result.
May I ask a question then? Because your coverage of the game is expansive, and like you say, the visceral live experience notwithstanding, what do you think you've taken away from covering the sport of football? I mean, maybe not life lessons like tie both your shoelaces and don't walk under ladders. More because football is such a it's put on a pedestal by the average person or the average fan, I think, to a certain degree. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around how footballers live, that footballers, managers, the people behind the scenes, there's a lot that goes on that you're privy to. And like you've said before, it's not necessarily interesting to the fans, but from yourself, it might be an insight, or it might be something that it recontextualizes something that you understood about it before. What do you think you've taken away from your coverage of football as I don't know, in general in life, or just a deeper appreciation for the sport itself, or about journalism? Is there anything that you've garnered that you weren't expecting to?
Um, I think one of the important things is to never, and it's something that I think that we probably all do at times, is we sometimes forget these guys are real people, and they start to become like, as I think, as we said earlier, like memes.
Well, they're definitely deified. That much is 100%. And in the same breath, they're put on pedestals so that when the time comes, right, cool, everyone got their tomatoes ready. You know,
Exactly.
it certainly seems that way.
So there is like this deification, memification.
Which none of us would want to be in that position. When all said and done, no one would willingly want to put themselves in that kind of firing line.
No, but at the same time, they do have amazing lives. Amazing lives. I'm not, I'm never going to be someone who says, oh, they've got money, therefore they should be happy. But they do have incredible lives, right? Like the things they're able to do for their families, for their local communities, particularly if they've come from an area where it was difficult for them growing up. So I think it is that. Every time I meet a footballer or someone who works in football, it's like a bit of a jolt to me to be like, because you can go, sometimes I'll go through with the way that I work, if I'm working on an investigation or something like that, then I might go sort of a couple of months without seeing a footballer face to face or interviewing a footballer or a manager or something, and it's therefore it's a good jolt because you can get into a routine of like you're watching games, you start laughing at him a bit, like everyone does, right? Like we all, that's what makes the sport so successful, right? That everyone has an opinion on it,
100%,
very quick opinions on it, and everyone is obsessed by it. But I do think that's the thing which I'm like working on as well, is just always trying to remember, there's a person there.
Is there anyone that you've met that you had a preconceived notion of and kind of I mean, I'm thinking along the lines of the ones that get me are usually the ones where you sit down and it's so the brash nature of Zlatan Ibrahimovic, for instance, is one that always gets me, because even though people are quite quick to put him in a situation where he's memeable, you have to be pretty goddamn intelligent to quip as well as he does. So from that perspective, I can respect it. But then you get someone like, I mean, the fact I didn't get a chance to ask Carl Anka about his books with Marcus Rashford, but the fact that Rashford, I don't know much about him as an individual, but the fact that he took it so passionately that he wants to be a part of, the idea of advocating for children's literacy, that speaks to a character of someone who at 20, how old is he? He's 24, 25 at this point, I believe. Is that, or am I thinking he's 23, 24? But he's a young man. Me at 24, I literally was going to work, coming home, finding something on telly like House or CSI Miami or something, and letting my brain melt. I didn't consider the wider world from any rational perspective. And you're right. These are people. These are young men finding their way in the world oftentimes, and now young women, which is fantastic. I was so happy to have that conversation with my daughter where she pointed at the screen and went, "Girls are playing, Daddy." I was like, "Yep. Can I do that one day? As long as it's for Arsenal, but yes." But it's great to have that conversation now, because these young men and women are going to have the opportunity to live out their dreams. And isn't that great? Ultimately, when you boil it down, like, I get the politics and the backstage bollocks, but ultimately it's a dream-making factory. At least that's how it's supposed to be, or at least what it's sold to be. And it's nice when someone actually enjoys that.
I think it still is, to be honest.
Because that's what I get curious about, your perspective from like you get to see how the sausage is made a lot of the time, and maybe it's not as pleasant as people might think when it's
what I still think is that football's greatest strength is its capacity for social mobility.
Sure.
Right? When you compare it to pretty much every other big sport in the UK in particular, you look at rugby, cricket, tennis, golf, cycling, rowing, maybe I'm forgetting one here, but when you look at the percentage of private school to state educated, when you look at working class backgrounds, football is the most accessible.
Sure.
Football is the sport that will take people from the most humble backgrounds and give them the most extraordinary lives. And I think there is still that is something that, for all of football's madness and money and anything we can criticize about it, that essence has been retained. When you look at the most famous players in the world, that has been retained. And there are weird things that are going on now in terms of players recruited at very, very young ages, and agents are all over them at very young ages, and fine. But there is still that, someone like Cristiano Ronaldo, I think people necessarily always appreciate where he came from to where he got to, and there's a lot of things that Cristiano Ronaldo would now be criticised for, but in terms of from where he was to where he got to become that superstar, I think that says extraordinary things about football's capacity for social mobility. Messi the same, right? And I think that's Sadio Mane is an amazing story as well. Mo Salah, and that is, I think that's football's biggest strength. And when it loses that's when it's gone, really. And I don't know if it will one day lose that, but there's no real sign of it so far.
Wow, that's a sober. I mean, I'd like to hearken on the positive side and say no. I think because it's not marketed, but it's fueled by youth, and ultimately the benefit of youth is naivety to the sort of the man-made architecture of the world through finances and capitalism, or the rest of that sort of stuff. They go in, just look, if you are good enough, you will succeed. Work hard enough and you will be good enough, and then you will succeed.
Yeah, but that's not true of so many sectors.
Sure. Which, sure. That much is, nepotism is still a thing. There's still, corruption at certain levels. But within the sport of football, it is a case of, look, ultimately you've got to put the ball in the back of the net. No amount of money and favours is going to cover you to getting the ball in the back of the net once the whistle blows.
Exactly. It's arguably one of the most evidence-based industries, right?
Oh, 100%. One of my big loves of TIFO is the fact that they cover analytics in such a easy and direct way, and obviously at The Athletic as well, you back up a lot of the articles and opinion pieces with sound data. This isn't something we're making up or we feel. This is something we've observed. This is something we can quantify.
Yeah, exactly.
Two very quick questions then to cap us off, and hopefully these are fun-filled questions with lots of wiggle room for ambiguity. What's one thing you change about football? You can't eliminate Arsenal from the leagues. I forbid it as an answer. He's stumped, ladies and gentlemen. I have quelled the unquenchable voice of Adam Crafton. There's nothing he can say in response. There's nothing he would change. I'd get rid of penalties if it's any help to you. Yeah. But one of the
penalties at the end of the game, or
one of the reason I don't like some aspects of football these days is because of its inherent gamesmanship, where when I was a kid, I got lumps kicked out of me and I was told to get up and play on. I remember my dad yelling that at me at the side of a pitch, and I'd been fucking leveled in that game. Get up, son! Come on! Now, if I'd have gotten leveled but stayed on my feet, I know that this, because I walk past kids' games quite frequently where I walk, where we walk the dogs, and I can hear parents of kids yelling, "Go down!" What do you mean, go down? The goal's there and he's got to kick it in the goal. That gamesmanship, I'm not a fan of. And where penalties come in, again, just to reference TIFO, they were referencing the fact that most penalties are awarded in non-goal scoring situations, and they adversely change the perspective of the game. I get from a storytelling perspective, it creates villains and it creates controversy, but look, I'm a I guess I'm a sporting purist. I want to see the best teams and the best players win. I don't want to see the craftiest teams and the craftiest players win. Speaking as an Arsenal fan who was a fan of 2001's Arsenal, where we were diving in cheating like motherfuckers, I understand it's tremendously hypocritical. But I wasn't old enough to appreciate that we shouldn't have been doing that shit back then. So I'll take my medicine with that one.
Yeah, no, I take that. I take that point. I think what I'd really like to see trialed is actually whether you could have a bit like you sort of have rugby sevens. I would like to see Premier League clubs asked to do basically, so you could turn the EFL Cup, Carabao Cup, into a seven-a-side competition.
Okie dokie.
And you could choose the play. There's two ways you could do it. You could either just ask clubs to have, seven players, seven players that they think would work for that, and the head coach would have to train it. I think that's quite fun. Like, how does Pep Guardiola go about picking a seven-a-side team? How does Tony Pulis go about picking a seven-a-side team? I think is quite fun. The other way you could do it is you could have it as a draft, right?
Ah, interesting. I thought you might say that. That's an interesting concept.
You could have it as a draft, but then how do you make the fans care about the results? Do you know what I mean? Like, you have the entertainment product, but how do you make the fans care?
Sure.
Because they don't have that bond with their team, perhaps, because you could have Man City's best player playing at Man United, which is a bit weird. So yeah, I would like to see them try that as like an EFL Cup alternative, because then, like, I imagine at some point, if that was to work, then it becomes like some sort of offshoot of the Champions League as well. And I think it would do very, very well. I don't think it would be for like a linear TV audience, but I think there'd be a huge sort of streaming audience, a huge social around it. Maybe I'm just talking like middle-aged man here, coming up with ideas.
Welcome to the obscurity of middle age, my friend. It's great. Everything annoys you. Everything hurts. Sitting up and standing up is great because you make noises when you do both. It's fantastic.
But yeah, I think it could be quite fun and quite interesting. Like, would clubs have to, when they're making summer transfers, need to, like, I don't know, get a player who's particularly well suited for seven-a-side? Is there a player who adds years onto his career by playing seven-a-side? Does someone come out of retirement for that team because they can cope with it? I don't know. I find, like, the idea of these like 4 competitions each year, I don't think they're necessary. I don't think, particularly if we're going to go into worlds where Winter World Cups become more common, which I think is quite possible.
You think so?
I think so, because if you've got the 2030 bid, Saudi Arabia, Greece, and Egypt, and I don't think it's that irrational, to be honest. It's only irrational in the sense of, like, it's something we've grown up with, that they're summer World Cups. But if you take the principle, I understand objections to World Cups, if it's based on how votes are decided and human rights and all the stuff that we'll talk about with Qatar, and all the stuff that would be applicable to Saudi and Egypt or whatever, and Greece. But from a climate point of view, like, it's just logical, right? And if this is a World Cup rather than, it's not a European Cup, then we have to deal with the fact that sometimes that will go to places where it makes more sense to be in a different time of year. And if that disrupts our lives a little bit, it's not the end of, it's not the end of the world. I mean, this season, like, I think I understand, like, the players' point of view, it's probably overload, combined with the way that it all landed with COVID and everything. But, like, from an entertainment point of view, there's just football all the time, isn't there?
Yes.
I don't think the industry of football will be that devastated about the way it's turned out.
If anything, I mean, I don't know if I would make this argument, but there's too much. Like, I believe it's someone on The Athletic made an article after watching a game of football every day for a year because it was physically possible to do so, which you think, Who needs to watch a game of football every single year? But more importantly, how can that be possible? But apparently, there's such an abundance of it that somewhere in the world, someone's playing a game of football every single day of the year.
Yeah. And at some point there will be some sorts of reckoning and compromise on that match calendar. That might be something like the Carabao Cup going, or because obviously they're now adding games to the Champions League as well next season as well. So you can't do you've got the Nations League that's been added, and I think they'd quite like to make that Nations League to incorporate South American teams into it as well at some point. But yeah, I think that's interesting. So I'd just like to see that little bit of innovation of formats.
Rather than just adding games and tournaments into the calendar.
Rather than adding games and making closed shops and stuff like that, I think there is space for innovation. People probably hate. I mean, the problem is, it's a bit like that Todd Boehly idea a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was actually quite a bad idea, the All-Star one.
Right, the Americanized sort of.
Yeah, the sort of All-Star game. And the problem there is, the messenger, right?
Right.
People look at it and think, he's been here 6 weeks and he's telling us how to run our game, kind of thing. And actually, he was at a conference, and in the room, it went down reasonably well, right? Problem was, it was being filmed, and therefore his audience wasn't just the room. The audience was everyone, and it blew up and that kind of thing. But it's not the worst idea in the world. It's not. His idea was that it would make £200 million or something for the EFL, and that would be redistributed. I don't think it would. I think that was my issue. I don't think it would make anywhere near that. I don't think it would necessarily engage audiences particularly well. I do think there's something from a gaming perspective that could be tied into something like that. I don't know if it's a way of, do you get EA involved, and I don't know, the top rated FIFA player in each position goes into it. I don't know, right? But I think that connection between gaming and innovation of formats within sport, I think, is interesting. I think it would be a more genuine reach out. If all these owners are concerned about the changing nature of audiences and stuff like that, I think that would be worth a try.
Is there much credence to that? Because I have my own theories, and I've debated vociferously with both Mr. Anchor and Mr. Divine on this. Changing audiences. I mean, is it really that noticeable that younger people are not gravitating towards watching full 90-minute segments of sporting events these days? Or is it a case like I was when I was a kid? Look, I just made a point of watching Arsenal games. I didn't watch every game, and even if I did watch an Arsenal game, if we were playing Wolves in the third round of the Worthington Cup, as it was known at the time, I'm going to go play outside. It was just, I was a kid. I just didn't watch games that didn't have more to what your fandom of football is. Look, sell me a story. Sell me a reason to care about this match first, apart from just blind fandom of my team's playing, and I'll watch. But I think this generation's a lot the same. That there has to be a selling point. It can't just be, well, why are you not watching these games? They're on. Well, yes, so they're on. There's fucking a million things to watch. Thousands of pieces of competition these days. Notwithstanding the fact, I can generate my own content. Why would I watch someone else's when I'm trying to build my own platform, or I'm trying to generate my own content? It's kind of understandable through that prism.
Yeah, all fair points. I don't think. Look, I think, of course, television audiences are falling. Of course they are, because you have so much more choice than you did many years ago in terms of how you spend your time and streaming platforms and things like that. It doesn't mean that television is necessarily doing anything wrong. And I think Sky Sports' banner slogan, isn't it? It's it's only live once. And that's a very valuable commodity.
In other words, no shit, Sherlock. Come on now.
It's actually I think it's quite clever in the sense of that is their biggest value.
They're trying to sell the experience rather than the actual content. Sure.
You can only live that first time you see your team score the last minute winner in a certain game once. And doing, and as that happens, can't be replicated by highlights. So I think there will always be a market for live sport on TV. In terms of changing audiences, I don't think it's necessarily that like younger people won't watch 90 minutes more than the past. Maybe the data says it is, but I think it's possibly people want to multi-screen more.
Sure.
So I don't know. So for example, I can watch a match tomorrow, but I can't just sit there and just watch the 90 minutes. I find that really difficult now. So I'm on my phone. I'll be following it on Twitter. I want to see what other people are saying. I want that to be a sociable experience on like friends' WhatsApp groups. I might be cooking at the same time. Do you know what I mean? I think attention spans are weaker. Like on that, I don't think that's like a boomer attitude towards millennials. I think
it's not even a debate.
I think that is like completely true. Like, yeah, I consider myself like reasonably smart. I find it really difficult now to just sit down and read a book, right? To just focus on that one thing, which is what you have to do when you're reading a book, because I'm obsessed with this thing and wanting to check what's going on and am I missing something, have I not replied to this and stuff like that. So yeah, I think changing audiences are true, but like the solution to that is not just let's stick Barcelona against Liverpool on TV every other week.
I mean, that does sound like a
the
TV executive thing as well.
The scarcity of those fixtures is what make them so watchable when they come.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
But that's fact. I didn't know that. I mean, because again, I'm presupposing something here, but you struggle with that. I just assumed that as you write for a living and you have to pay keen attention to the details. Like, you're a mortal person. You swipe and you go down rabbit holes and whatnot.
Yeah, most of my life. Yeah,
I don't blame you. We all do.
I had to delete TikTok from my phone because it was
draining. It was stealing like hours from you, was it?
It was hours of my life just disappearing. And I also found it very exposing.
Exposing?
Yeah, the algorithm is very exposing of what are the things that you really want to see.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah. And so it's actually something I want to now start doing with footballers when I interview them, is ask to see their TikTok. Because I think it would tell you more in like 5 swipes than you would discover in an hour of conversation.
Interesting. And oh wow, you are pushing the boat out as far as trust. Number one, you're sitting them down. Number two, you're asking questions. Now, right, unlock your phone, give me TikTok, and do you know what? The last half an hour might as well not have happened. Let's just Ooh, hang on, and like, interesting. Well, I mean, I agree with that, if only for the fact that Andrew Tate was a thing, and that completely just fucking, I couldn't get away from that asshole for the longest time, so I ended up getting rid of shorts and YouTube, fucking all the rest of that bollocks, because I just don't see the value in that content necessarily, because I'm like you, I fell down rabbit holes from time to time, and I'd realise I've just spent half an hour and I'm not entertained. I'm just swiping through crap, or reposted clips from Peaky Blinders and quote clips from some fucking movie where Tom Hardy goes, "You got to fight to whatever." I was like, "Fuck is this?" Just seemed weird. I'm very much in the same. Like podcasts, cool. I'll chuck it on the background and I'll listen to it while I'm doing my thing. That'll do me down to the ground. If I can find a good podcast series, all for it. That's all good. Okay, one last quick question. And we shall let you return to your life. What's something that you would change about the journalism landscape? Is there anything that either... I'm thinking more in terms of the engagement on social media, because you're not the only person I've seen have that kind of exchange with people where it's both overwhelmingly positive, I'm sure. You know, you get plenty of people tweeting you saying, that they love your work and they think, but occasionally you get that one asshat who completely misses the fucking point, and you end up having to go.
Yeah, I wouldn't change that. I quite like. I don't mind the sort of social media, the sort of the pros and the cons of it. Like obviously, the abuse is not good. Um, but I like the ecosystem of social media um, quite a lot. I don't want things like verified profiles and all of that kind of thing.
You don't?
No,
Interesting. How come?
because well,
Do you
for
think it
many
just
reasons,
dissuades people from saying what they actually think then?
possibly, but you also have we not everyone lives in a country like Britain, right? So
Ah, I got you.
so
I
so
got
for
you.
example, if I'm living in Iran at the moment and I want to be tweeting, what my actual opinion is about protests that are going on, for example, is that safer under some sort of pseudonym name? Possibly, right? So I think for like dissidents in difficult regimes,
Mm.
I think there's justified grounds for it, and also things like if you're gay growing up in a country where you can't be gay, but you're looking, I suppose, for just sort of some form of community online. I think there's a great power in that. So I think that's where one of the things that like Premier League footballers always say is we need everyone to have verified profiles. And I'm like, well, yeah, that would work for you, and that would work to solve your issue, but that doesn't work. That doesn't work on a universal global website, and that's that's one of like the biggest challenges facing humankind is how do you regulate the internet when you don't have a global government, right? We're not going into that now because we don't have time.
No,
But
100%.
right, but that is one of the biggest challenges, facing everyone. In terms of what I would change in journalism, very easy answer. I would just like there to be far more empathy in the portrayal of trans people in the British media at the moment, because I think at the moment it's become on both sides of the debate. I think it's become very dehumanizing, very toxic, getting nowhere really for anyone involved. And I think there are like fair and justified conversations to be had about how do we make sure that fairness in women's sport is protected, but also at the same time making sure that we remain humane in the way that we are writing and treating and framing a very, very, very small minority of people who have often had to endure really, really, really difficult lives to get to the point where they feel like strong enough to begin that process of transitioning or begin identifying in different ways publicly. Like that, I can't really relate to it, right? Like being gay is not being gay is not as difficult, basically. Being gay in the UK is not as difficult as it is to be trans, and I can't really relate to that feeling of I feel like I'm in a body that I don't really belong in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you're in the Mystique versus Rogue situation, in that your status or your defining feature that causes some kind of controversy, at least in some people's eyes, it's not overt. Whereas transgender people do have to face that to a certain degree, at least in some instances. And when it becomes a point of contention, when their situations are often held up in the worst of circumstances, rather than, again, what you're saying, which is right, but just again treat it from a place of humanity. These are people.
Yeah,
they're trying to live their lives. They're not trying to impose their will on you. They're trying to just do the things you do, but without facing discrimination or persecution and having to go throughout their days looking at just dealing with looks. Like, if you've ever just walked down the street and had people give you a dirty look, okay, times that by every fucker walking past you. How would you like to live that life? From a perspective of complete ignorance, rather than just, again, why don't you just engage from the perspective of, again, human beings, understanding, patience, and love. Just come from there, and we can try and find compromise and fair grounds. And like you say, it's not about undermining either side. It's about understanding where the concerns are and addressing them from a considered perspective, not from a fear-mongering perspective.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, that's what I would change at the moment. But that's going to be a long conversation, I think.
One hell of a long conversation because of just how radically things can change. But from the same time, you could make the argument, yeah, but it should have changed a long time ago. So we should have already been at this point. But the fact that we're not at this point, we've got to contend with, again, just simple things like argue on things on their merits, not on the historical relevance. Like, oh, well, this is new, right? Okay, but what are the merits? What are the arguments being made? Yeah, I'm sorry I get so animated by this, by the way.
No, not at all.
Like I say, I'm in a weird position. Current housemate's gay, last housemate was transgender, and in both situations, I had very frank and open conversations with them about just generally anything. And whenever the conversation turned to those topics, they were both always like, do you not have questions? I'm like, no. Why not? Because you're you. I don't really care about any of that stuff unless you want to talk about it, in which case, cool. I'm all ears. But I don't think... Do you want to hear about me being straight? I tell you about that as much as you like. It's really boring. It consists of gaming and getting told no by girls on POF. It's really not that interesting an experience. It's very insular, to be honest with you. But okay. You've answered my silly 2 questions, in which case, let's wrap this up by saying, where can people find you? Where can people support you? And more importantly, how do they not get roasted by you on Twitter? Because I've seen it happen. It's a rookie mistake. Don't fuck with a writer on Twitter. He will beat you. So where can people find you? Where can people support you?
You can find my writing at The Athletic. You can follow me on Twitter at Adam Crafton _. And generally I'm pretty nice to people, so you don't need to worry about the last bit.
Well, just don't say something silly. Just if you've got a question, ask it nicely. Then you'll be fine. Or a decent question, ask it nicely. Don't go, and sidle up to him as if you know what he's a journalist. He writes about shit for a living. He knows more than you do, probably. Unless you're God himself, in which case I have questions. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. And yeah, this has been fun. Again, overwhelmed to a certain degree, having read upon you and researched you and seen your accolades and seen just what an accomplished career you've led and where you threaten to go from here. Yeah, keep going, man. Like 28 years old, I feel like I need to go and write something, anything, get it published. I feel like I've accomplished something now.
Thank you. That's very kind.